about transnational repression in digital space. And also we have Dana Rose from University of Notre Dame, who discussed transnational repression among diasporas, especially in Syria, Syrian and Libyan diaspora in the Western world. And also we have Ed Lemon from Bush School in DC. He talked about regional transnational repression, transnational organization in Eurasia, especially the role of Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the extraterritorial repression. So we have Yana Gorokhovskaya from Freedom House. She moderated the panel, and she pretty much talked about their efforts to collect data on transnational repression, and also discuss the role of Turkey as a perpetrator, also as a host state for the state repression. So if you missed the panel, you can always reach it from orionpolicy.org, and also its YouTube page. Today we have another great panel to continue to talk about transnational repression. We have Noura Aljizawi and Siena Anstis from CitizenLab at University of Toronto. Welcome. And we have Natalia Hall from Harriman Institute at Columbia University. Welcome, Natalia. And we have Jing-Jie from Safeguard Defenders, and he's joining us from Paris. Welcome to all. I'd like to begin our conversation with Noura Aljizawi and Siena from CitizenLab. Noura, you have an incredible background as a victim of state repression, and you had been imprisoned and tortured by Assad government in Syria, but you managed to survive and became a vice president of the Syrian opposition forces and SNC. Then you left opposition in 2016 and initiated an NGO named StartPoint that provides advocacy and psychological support to Syrian women who have suffered torture, sexual violence in detention. Now you serve as a researcher at the CitizenLab at Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, and you study digital transformation, digital transnational repression, digital authoritarianism, and human rights. And our second speaker from CitizenLab, Siena Anstis, she's a lawyer and senior legal advisor at the CitizenLab. She also does research in the areas of international law, human rights, and technology and migration. And you both co-author a fascinating research report on the psychological and emotional war, digital transnational repression in Canada, published in 2022. And your study based on the interviews with the victims and transnational repression. Would you please let us know more about your research? And just a reminder, we are going to have a Q&A session after our presentations. Please feel free to input your questions. I'm asking this for our participants, for our audience. So don't wait till end of the presentations. We'll be happy to answer your questions. So I will turn it over to Noura and Siena.
Thank you so much. I think Siena would go first, and then I will take the second section of the presentation.
Perfect. And Noura, are you presenting slides?
I don't think I can share my screen.
Okay, no worries. That's totally fine. Yeah, no so thanks very much for inviting us to be here. It's a pleasure. So for those of you who don't know the CitizenLab, I'll just do a little introduction. So our work over the past 2 decades has focused on studying how surveillance technologies are used by governments to infringe on human rights. And over the past few years, we started coming across several cases of cross-border targeted surveillance of human rights activists and journalists, which pushed us to want to develop a specific research stream into digital transnational repression, which is what we're going to speak about today. So briefly, I'll speak a bit about transnational repression, especially for those who weren't able to attend the first seminar, and dig into the concept of digital transnational repression. And I'll also do a brief introduction of our research program at the CitizenLab on digital transnational repression, which was the foundation for the report that was just mentioned. And then Noura will talk in more detail about the types of technologies we saw used by state actors undertaking digital transnational repression, and we'll discuss, which I think is probably the most interesting part, the social and psychological impacts of this type of activity. And then if there's time, we can close with some recommendations on how we think, for example, the Canadian government, but also applicable to other governments, might address digital transnational repression. So Before looking at digital transnational repression, I think it's important to have a general sense of what is transnational repression. I'll go through this a bit more quickly with the understanding that many people probably have attended the first panel. So transnational repression describes situations where governments act to silence, harass, or intimidate dissidents and activists, usually nationals of their country, but not necessarily always, who are living abroad in what we call the host state. So in other words, this covers situations where states extend their repressive policies and practices outside their territorial boundaries and into the territories of other countries, the host states. A regularly cited example of this type of behavior was the brutal murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi authorities in Turkey. This is one of many, many examples that we've seen over the past few years. And of course, Freedom House's 2 reports on transnational repression are a great starting place to sort of develop a foundational understanding of what we're talking about. And I think Jana might have mentioned this last time, but it's quite difficult to sort of understand and understand the frequency and scope of incidents of transnational repression. But like I said, the Freedom House report makes a good first stab at doing that. So I believe they reviewed 608 cases of direct physical cases of transnational repression between 2014 and 2020, but this would likely include many more cases if we're including, for example, digital cases or non-public cases. I think one thing to note is that's quite interesting and impressive is the number of countries that are engaging in this type of activity. So I think it was a total of 31 countries engaging in transnational repression, taking place in a total of 79 host countries. So the country in which the dissident or activist is living in when they're being targeted once they're outside their country of origin. I think Freedom House also made the important point, and other researchers as well, that transnational repression is becoming normalized, and their data suggests that this practice is widespread. It engages not only powerful and well-resourced governments, but also smaller states that would think less capable of engaging in this type of activity due to limited resources. Further, it's happening in numerous different host states, both democratic and authoritarian, and many of these states would generally be considered safe for dissidents, for example, the targeting that we saw in Canada, but these numbers suggest a different reality on the ground. So let's take a closer look at what is digital transnational repression, now that we have a sort of a basic understanding of transnational repression. So we consider digital transnational repression to be sort of an extension of transnational repression. So we define as situations where countries of origin using digital technologies act to silence, persecute, harass, or intimidate dissidents and activists living abroad or in exile. So in short, digital and transnational repression is transnational repression using digital technologies. And finally, just before I close on with more details in our research program, I just want to sort of give you a sense of why we think studying digital transnational repression is important as a distinct aspect of transnational repression. I think it's of particular interest because these types of digital activities are highly scalable. So technology makes it relatively cheap, depending on what technology you're using, to engage in activities that can silence or constrain dissent, not only domestically, but abroad as well. And there are a growing number of options for how this type of repression can be undertaken, from, for example, the use of expensive spyware to less expensive phishing campaigns to gain personal information, for example, in order to identify a network of activists, many of whom, for example, might still be in the country of origin and thus susceptible to being detained and tortured and so on. And Noura will provide, I think, a helpful overview of some of the types of digital technologies that we saw used in against dissidents and activists in Canada. Safe to say that digital transnational repression involves the use of digital technologies, which are easily adaptable and relatively flexible. Another important point is that there's little accountability for what happens in these situations. So we know that, for example, states may be adverse to public attribution of cyber incidents just as a starting point. So Canada may not want to point fingers, for example, at the Saudi government. It can also be hard for those targeted to discover when these activities are happening. For example, spyware is next to impossible, I think, for the average person to sort of determine whether it's on their device, and they have to consult with specialists. And it can be very difficult to prosecute these types of cases as well for for similar reasons, if it even gets to the point where law enforcement takes it seriously, which is another issue we saw in our research. And I think finally, it's likely that we will see more and more uses of digital technologies to silence dissent abroad, which matches sort of how digital technologies are being used within authoritarian regimes to silence dissent within the borders of the countries of origin. The surveillance industry is rapidly expanding. There are more and more new tools coming on the market. And we see, for example, with the proliferation of spyware, that the mercenary spyware industry, the existence of a private sector that will supply these tools to basically any country that can afford to pay, is causing serious concerns with regards to targeting of human rights defenders and civil society. So before handing it over to Noura, I'll talk a little bit about our research program that we had in Canada, that we have been running in Canada. So as I mentioned, we've seen more and more cases of digital transnational repression in our research into digital technologies and human rights. And we were very curious to gain more visibility into what's happening in Canada because it hadn't been researched before. We were particularly interested in understanding the social and psychological impacts of this type of targeting, to understand, for example, if it prevented people from engaging in transnational advocacy, or if it impaired their ability to successfully resettle and find a new community in Canada. So participants in our research program, which is still ongoing, were people who have moved to Canada or fled to Canada from other countries and self-reported as being politically engaged still in their country of origin. This included people now living in Canada who were outspoken against their home country's authoritarian regimes, for example, Syrian activists, Saudi activists, dissidents who had fled Hong Kong, among others. And our goal was really, as I mentioned, to understand how digital transnational repression was impacting people on a day-to-day level. So I would encourage you to obviously read the report, and Noura will provide, I think, some interesting details and salient points from our research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siena. And yeah, besides the report, we have like a very nice and interesting clip that we try to summarize within it, the stories of the participants in this research. So I will try to speak a little bit about the technologies that's being used in the digital transnational repression. I guess like many people who are watching us now are asking themselves what digital transnational repression looks like in practice. And again, in all of my presentation, I'm not saying like this is the entire scene or the whole scene of the digital transnational repression. I'm only drawing from the experiences of the participants in our study. So it's very limited to the data or to the interviews we managed to conduct in the first phase of our study. For instance, like participants identify a wide range of technologies that being used in the digital targeting on them in exile and specifically in Canada. For instance, like the spyware, malware, phishing of their emails and accounts takeover, also SIM card swapping, online harassment, social media harassment, and trolls. Besides the disinformation, DDoS attacks on their organizations or personal websites or business websites also, in addition to the censorship. Unfortunately, given the limited time of this session, I won't be able to dig in details and to explain every single mean of these digital threats, but we can maybe cover some of these aspects in the Q&A session. As Siena mentioned, we tried also to study the psychological and emotional impacts of these digital threats, and study and somehow how these victims who experience digital transnational repression and maybe other means of transnational repression have been impacted emotionally, psychologically, physically, how their day-to-day life had been impacted, how they managed to survive, to socialize whether in Canada or with people in their home country. So while this project will only focus on Canada, but we think that the results are universal, and we encourage other researchers to study other contexts beside the Canadian context. In addition to our ongoing research, we can talk about it, how we are moving forward in this. So we specifically ask participants about how their health, for instance, have been impacted, and they describe how digital transnational repression has negatively impacted their physical health. For instance, one of them said, "I'm in constant pain, whether it's stress, headache, or just pain that I hold in my body." They also describe different means of or different impacts of mental health as an example, like feeling guilty, unsafe, insecure, traumatic, suffering uncertainty, paranoia, and other means of mental health disorders, just as an impact of these digital transnational repression. They also describe how they become unable to sleep or to eat properly. One of the participants told us that I was not expecting that there would be a huge attack campaign on me by Saudi trolls. I was shocked, and I couldn't think properly, I couldn't sleep properly, I couldn't eat properly, and I couldn't make decisions properly. So consequently, the digital threats have impacted their work and careers negatively. They describe how they couldn't manage to focus, whether in their day-to-day activities like conducting their work, how their careers have been impacted, and also how their studies and ability to concentrate in schools. One of them said it's very stressful, especially when you study. When you are in school, you are only attending your school. You are listening to what the professor is saying with only 20% of your mind. The rest is somewhere else. They also noted how they feel like they need to self-censor themselves online or in real life because they started to feel unsafe. They describe how every single step that they do is calculated carefully because they need to mitigate the risk. And the sense of unsafety expands beyond their own safety. Safety of others is one of the concerns they raised in the interviews. Thus, they self-censor themselves even on the very personal, ordinary calls, such as calling their families back home. One told us that we don't speak directly and explicitly. In case the communication is censored, they wouldn't really understand what the content of the conversation is. And as maybe many of you know, usually the newcomers, regardless of their status and the purpose of their resettlement to new country, they rely on social networks with communities from their country of origin to resettle. However, for some of the individuals who've been subjected to digital transnational repression, such networks or communities might be a source of fear, as they feel anxious about the possibility of being targeted through these networks by authoritarian regimes, loyalists, or informants. A participant expressed how they try to avoid any interaction or socialization with the people from their country of origin in Canada, saying, "I'm just limiting who I'm meeting with so that I'm limiting the threat coming from any potential target." Whereas others avoid socializing with people from their country of origin because they feel afraid and concerned for the safety of these people. One said that, "I don't want them to suffer any consequences from associating with me." Unfortunately, we know that men and women are being targeted digitally and physically, also in transnational repression and digital transnational repression. But the experience of female activists was a bit different. As many human rights organizations maybe reported how authoritarian regimes commit sexual and gender-based violence as a mean of torture, physically the female activists are when they are not in the physical reach of the authoritarian regimes, digital technology enabled these regimes to digitalize the violence. Several participants noted that the online harassment they faced often had a gender-based component, and several females describe how the misogynistic gender-based forms of harassment they faced when described like she received like very descriptive rape message that she believed like this message was formed on misogyny. Others said that they targeted her based on her appearance, and another one explained how she was stalked while she was walking in Canada on the street. Also, like all of these components together, besides the other means of repression and digital repression that the dissidents face, take us to the conclusion that dissidents' departure from their country of origin don't necessarily resolve their concerns regarding their physical safety. Many dissidents and activists don't feel safe in Canada, whereas, like, to be fair, some of them said like they feel relatively safe because their country of origin is a bit far away from Canada and they don't believe like they are reachable, although they are experiencing the digital transnational repression. Some participants noted that in addition to digital transnational repression, they were also subjected to other means of physical repression. Among the, like for instance, the physical threats, death threats, when received a message that don't think because you are in Canada, you are safe. Another one was told that the bullet that will go through you is made in China. And other reported that they've been physically surveilled and stalked in Canada. The question all the time was like, why you didn't, we asked the participants, we were very curious how their experience was in interacting with the law enforcement. Usually people who come from authoritarian context, they have a bit different impression about interacting with the law enforcement. However, it was like quite surprising that participants in our study reach to the law enforcement, try to report the different means of harassment, whether like physical or digital harassment, to the Canadian law enforcement, whether like the police, RCMP, CSIS, and they, in general, they describe the response from the law enforcement in Canada like unhelpful. And they were frustrated with the lack of governmental assistance, and they felt like they were forced to deal with the digital transnational repression alone. One of the participants, for instance, told us that she raised the issue of digital transnational repression she's been subjected to with like a Canadian high-level official in the Canadian government, but she felt that there was no recognition or support for the Canadians who are facing such concerns or such kind of attacks. I think that's all from my end. In the meantime, I'm really looking forward to the questions, and maybe we can discuss more in details some concepts we raised. I don't know if do you want now, Siena, to jump to the recommendations, or we can keep them to the end. Okay, thank you so much.
So we're going to put the Q&A session at the end. Siena
Awesome.
And Noura, thank you so much for this kind of interesting research, and I believe you're going to get so much interesting questions. And it's interesting to see how the technology works as a double-edged sword, right? It is used pretty much by the activists, right, to reach larger audience, especially with the social media, but then it turns out to be a long arms of these authoritarian regimes. Thanks again for the framework and also for your findings about your research. Let's turn to our next speaker, Natalia Hall. Natalia is a research fellow at Harriman Institute at Columbia University, and she specializes on Eurasian security matters, And prior to her position at Harriman Institute, she worked at the Carnegie Endowment International Peace on the Russia and Eurasia program and at the Eurasia Foundation. And she co-authored a report with Ed Lemon, who was one of the panelists in our first session. And they worked on the China's transnational repression of Uyghurs. And I turn it over to Natalia.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you very much for convening this panel today. It's been great to hear from a lot of these wonderful panelists a lot on these topics. A lot of their work has informed my own, so it's great to be here. First, I'm going to start with some overall remarks about the data set that Ed and I have collected, and then turn to two specific case studies of detention and refoulement. So since 2021, my colleagues at the Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs and I have documented 7,100 incidents of transnational repression involving Uyghurs or other Turkic minorities from Xinjiang. This is comprehensive research, as you can see, but there is a deep lack of available information based on the nature of transnational repression and the limitations of our methodology. We're looking specifically at news media and a few interviews, but there's a lot underexplored here in this area, as both Noura and Siena noted in their presentation. The scope of transnational repression is much, much wider, and we merely have shed a light on a small corner of a much more vast reality for Uyghurs and many other Turkic minorities living abroad. Our data represents that this is a truly global issue. We see cases of transnational repression appearing in 44 countries worldwide. Our trends over time mirror approximately what is happening in Xinjiang, waves of outmigration due to crackdowns and announcements, and then that is strongly correlated to geography. So for example, in 2014, Xi Jinping announced his Strike Hard campaign. There was also incidents of violence in Xinjiang during that period. Uyghurs largely fled abroad through Southeast Asia and onward to Turkey. And so we see during that period a sharp increase of cases of detention and refoulement in Southeast Asia in correlation to that travel. Of the approximately 7,100 cases that we've seen, 1,500 about involve the extralegal detention and or refoulement of Uyghurs living abroad. And I want to take you guys through two case studies to really speak to the heart of what I'm really talking about. I know that the words detention and refoulement say things, but I want to give it a feeling of what that means. So the first case I'm going to talk about is that of Ersin Erkinoglu. He fled Xinjiang for Kazakhstan in 2019 after seeing those around him disappear into the camps. Erkinoglu claimed that he did not feel safe in Kazakhstan and was worried that the government might deport him, so he fled to Turkey, where he applied for refugee status. The government of Turkey denied that application, so Erkinoglu fled into Europe, ultimately ending up in Ukraine. Once in Ukraine, he reported that he had experienced harassment from unknown individuals and tried to leave for Poland and then Slovakia, but was detained. And in the latter case, actually deported back to Ukraine for not having a passport. In Ukraine, he was detained in Lviv and set to go on trial in August 2021 for illegally crossing the border. But due to delays and then the escalation of this case, Erkinoglu was still in detention when the war in Ukraine started in February 2022 and experienced difficulties fleeing the conflict as it unfolded. He is now in Poland thanks to the work of human rights activists and lawyers who helped get him across the border without the proper documentation generally needed for that sort of thing. But he's there now, he is safe for the moment. In Erkinoglu's case, we see a number of detentions, deportations, and this clear lack of documentation, which really presents a problem for Uyghurs and Kazakhs fleeing Xinjiang. I will touch on that later in my presentation. The next case I'm going to talk about is that of Zinetgul Tursun, and I want to apologize in advance that this case is one of the more disturbing ones that we've seen of refoulement. In June 2019, Zinetgul Tursun and her two daughters were detained and held in the Izmir Detention Center in Istanbul. They were deported to Tajikistan against their will after allegedly being given fake Tajik passports. All three were Turkish residents at the time of this deportation. Eyewitness testimony alleges that they were given drugs that knocked them out prior to the flight and that they only regained consciousness once on the plane. There were other Uyghurs on the flight, according to the Tajik eyewitnesses. From Dushanbe, Tajikistan, Tursun was allegedly sent on to Urumqi and then on to Gulja, where her mother reports seeing her before she disappeared. It is likely that Zinetgul was placed either in a re-education camp or in Xinjiang's carceral system. The Turkish government, in cooperation with Tajik authorities, later claimed that Zinetgul had entered Turkey from Syria in May 2019, and that she was a Tajik national named Rahima Akhmedova. I personally did a lot of extensive research into this case to see if there were any grounds to those claims. I was not able to verify anything that did not come from the Turkish government or Tajik authorities. So these claims are highly specious and don't really add up with everything else that we know about this. This is a very extreme case. This is a case that we actually coded as rendition as part of our data set due to its extremity. This has had an extraordinary chilling effect on the Uyghur community in Istanbul, with many specifically citing this case as the reasoning behind their refusal to take action or protest out of fear of detention and deportation. I also want to emphasize the role of Tajikistan here. The government of Tajikistan, as I'm sure Ed mentioned in his presentation a couple of weeks ago, often engages in transnational repression against its own citizens. However, it has also helped support China's transnational repression. According to ICC documents between 2016 and 2018, more than 2,900 Uyghurs have disappeared from Tajikistan alone. That is an estimated to be a drop of 90% of the population of Uyghurs living in Tajikistan. Tajikistan has a particularly close relationship to China. They have a deep economic relationship defined largely by Tajikistan's debt to the Chinese government. And there are ongoing rumors of a People's Armed Police base in Tajikistan along the Wakhan corridor, suggesting that the security relationship between this Central Asian state and China is deepening. The other approximately 5,500 cases of transnational repression that we see are incidents of harassment and intimidation of Uyghurs living abroad, similar to what Siena and Noura just outlined. This harassment and intimidation includes a wide array of tactics used by the Chinese state, from phone calls and messages on WeChat to smear campaigns. These smear campaigns are particularly difficult to watch, as they are often involving family members of the targeted individual being brought out by the Chinese state to specifically call that person a liar, a cheater, claim that they'd stolen money from the family, etc. It is really quite horrific. Cyber attacks, as Noura and Siena just outlined, and the use of proxies in Xinjiang, which are used by the Chinese state to force Uyghurs into divulging personal information, returning to China, or divulging information of community members who they interact with on a daily basis. There have actually been 2 cases in the West of espionage, explicit charges of espionage brought against Uyghurs for this particular type of coercive espionage that we see. As I know we just talked about the cyber attacks, I won't speak too much to those, but that is something that we see very intensively focused on the Uyghur community, particularly against the World Uyghur Congress, against Uyghur Human Rights Project. Among many of these organizations that are particularly vocal about what's been happening, we see a lot of repeated DDoS attacks, APTs, and this is an ongoing problem. I want to return particularly to the denial of documentation for Uyghurs. This has a number of second and third order effects that Siena and Noura started to outline. Uyghurs really struggle to claim refugee status in a lot of countries because they do not have valid passports or other forms of documentation, which is a very specific and explicit tactic leveraged by the Chinese government to prevent this. Without refugee status, Uyghurs can't attend school. The children cannot attend school. They cannot legally find work. And because of this, many Uyghurs living abroad have become homeless and struggle to sustain themselves financially. We've also seen many cases of family separation where children are left alone in Istanbul after their parents have disappeared into the camps. So we see a wide nexus of these problems, and as my co-author and I argue in our upcoming report, this is a secondary humanitarian crisis. We see a lot of challenges to Uyghurs' mental well-being, their livelihoods, and their legal legibility. So I hope this really broad overview of our research has been helpful and informative, and I really look forward to answering questions during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Natalia. This is a kind of incredible facts and the data that you share with us. Thank you so much. And also, it's interesting to see how some governments actually works as a perpetrator of transnational repression, and also host these kind of transnational repression activities in their own countries. It's a kind of interesting relationship, especially in the Eurasia region. So let's move on to our third speaker, or the third presentation, Jing-Jie, who's a researcher at Safeguard Defenders. So Safeguard Defenders is a Europe-based NGO that works to promote human rights and the rule of law in Asia. And Jing actually focused on China's state media and its role in extraterritorial repression. So would you please tell us more about your research, Jing?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. So I just want to add a bit on Safeguard Defenders. Well, now it's based in Europe, but for the past 10 years, well, it also was based in Beijing. So it has a lot of local connections. So the reports and the resources we got are also kind of in relations with the daily work of the human rights lawyers and also human rights activists in China. So today I will talk about two things. One is perhaps like the general transnational repression by China through different campaigns, namely Fox Hunt and Skynet. Another one is the role of state media in kind of supporting the argument in terms of, say, going abroad to arrest or kind of persuade all those fugitives to come back to China for trial. So all of the panelists have mentioned about the transnational repression, but I would like to talk a bit more about kind of a branch of transnational repression that we call is involuntary returns. So this is a term especially to use to describe non-traditional, often illegal means of forcing someone to return to China against their will. So it often takes forms in threatening their family still living in China, or sending agents to have direct contact or have phone calls to targets abroad, or basically the last mean is kidnapping, bringing them illegally to China. So here I would like to talk about these two campaigns that I mentioned. One is Fox Hunt, Liefu. Basically, it's an operation run by the Ministry of Public Security in China. It's established in July 2014 as kind of a branch to fight people, Chinese nationals especially, who ran abroad, and then to try to find different ways to bring them back. This includes legal ways such as extradition treaties, where countries with extradition agreements with China to bring those criminals back. It also has a bit flexible and a bit vague definition of how they're gonna bring back. So including those I mentioned, having contact with agents in host countries, or basically kidnapping them. And then we also see a very interesting development after Xi Jinping came into power. That is in 2018. That is in 2015. That a more broad framework, let's say, under anti-corruption campaign proposed by Xi Jinping to be established in China and have wide range of activities. And this includes Fox Hunt that I mentioned before. So this broad network of broad operations was mostly conducted and directed by CCDI. CCDI is a Chinese Communist Party organ, basically run and to define who are criminals and who might have issues with corruption, and basically help Xi Jinping to run with this anti-corruption campaign. In 2018, we see this interesting development, especially in the China's National Congress with the amendment of constitutional law. That is, they established a new institution called National Supervision Commission, that basically is not a real judicial or legal organization, but it's mentioned in this constitutional amendment, doing basically the same work, very associated with the Chinese Communist Party's work, CCDI, and then to help them to carry on all this definition of who will be fugitives, who will be criminals, who might actually doing something illegal, illegal according to the Chinese Communist Party's definition, and who are still living abroad. And then so they kind of supervise these activities, operations to bring people from abroad to China. And another interesting thing is with this all operations, China state media has been very useful both for us researchers, but also for them authorities to justify their activities. So this is very important in China and abroad. One of them is the attack on human rights defenders and the trust of human rights activist societies, both in China and abroad. By having this propaganda, basically sponsored by Chinese state media, CCTV and CGTN, which is an international version of CCTV, that basically use clips or videos from both measure, so many torture or other means to force people, victims of human rights defenders or human rights lawyers, to say that, sorry, I have done something wrong, I actually committed a crime, but those confessed or basically forced, pre-recorded or basically scripted by the Chinese authority. And they tag these video clips and broadcast in different places in China and also abroad to kind of build the distrust within the community, so that when a new person, say, coming abroad, finally to seek for asylum, finally trying to settle in the local community, people seeing this video clips might have this suspicion or distrust against this person. That is a longer term lasting impact on human rights activists and human rights defenders abroad. We also observe a different kind of way for them to increase their surveillance. One is in their Chinese Facebook called Weibo that starting this year, they have to the addresses or the locations of the users have to be shown publicly. So then the online police or anyone who can actually see your comment will be able to see, for example, you're in Shanghai or you're abroad. And that is also very interesting because mostly when people are having their user address abroad, their comments are considered as non-valid or say pro-Western. And this kind of distrust in the society, especially in online, will also be very, very difficult for people to actually speak about things they generally have seen and have witnessed. And another thing is the fox hunt and also the Skynet operations has been going very broad and has been increasingly used since Xi Jinping came into power. So I would like to talk about several different means for Chinese authority to kind of impose this transnational repression in different places. So I talked about extradition agreements that Chinese authorities have with different countries. Now we have, China has ratified 43 extradition agreements with 14 other they have signed, but they are still waiting for other countries to ratify. And this also includes the European countries such as Spain, Belgium, and Lithuania, and Czech Republic. So this is a very concerning issue because, well, with extradition treaty, well, China especially can demand all those countries to send people who they identify as criminals to come back to China. This also faced a bit difficulties, especially in the case of Cyprus, where we found one person who secretly being targeted by China and then put on the red notice through the Interpol system. And this person was not able to identify or not being able to see. And I will talk about this case but later because this is kind of like a mixed measure that we have seen. So these are the legal means. But mostly we have discovered these illegal means such as reaching out to their family members in China and or directly contacting themselves abroad or basically kidnapping them from abroad. This is very kind of famous quote by the Chinese. They say, well, no matter where you are, no matter what kind of nationality you have, as long as you have family history of China, you're always Chinese nationals. And then so Chinese government can always come after you to bring you back to China for justice. And this includes their online critics of Chinese government or any activities that Chinese government seems to be pointing out to be against the authority. So the way kind of asking their family members in China in order to bring them back to China is especially concerning because this is a general policy of China's overseas operation that is called persuaded return. And that is also kind of under our framework of involuntary returns. So we have this one case. This case is called Xie Weidong, who was actually the former judge on China's Supreme Court. But then he was then moved to Canada and he started to criticize China's criminal justice system. And then he was then targeted. And he was targeted because he was contacted by the police. Well, especially saying that, well, his sister in China has been detained. And in order to save his sister, he will have to come back to China and to face the justice. And this is just one of the examples where we have recorded several ones. Another method is to send agents overseas. And this, as I say, it's a bit more complicated because technically Chinese police cannot operate in foreign soil, but then sometimes Chinese police can also get just tourist visa and then operate in different countries illegally. And we have seen several countries actually. So in the US and also Canada, intelligence and also government officials have issued and has actually started investigations about Chinese agents operating in their countries. One of the examples I would like to highlight from our recent report that is called 110 Overseas. Basically, Chinese police established this relationship with local overseas associations. Mainly, these associations having connections with China's governments, and quite often in this small association, they have these police service stations. What does it mean, police service stations? Well, according to them, this is a station that is to help them to get, say, driver's license, or to help them with registrations if they have a child born abroad. But then this can be also used in different forms. One of the cases we found in Spain, that was this person who originally came from China, but then came into Spain. He was then reached out, through this kind of network, like this Chinese Overseas Associates network, to reach out to him to be able to tell him that, well, actually, the Chinese police has located you and has also brought in your family member, and then we are going to have this kind of online meeting. Well, basically, the online meeting is with present officials, police, and also prosecutors. In this online meeting, they try to bring this idea about, well, this is very important for you to come back to China. But then, of course, this way of being able to locate this person abroad and then to bring him back into this online meeting at the presence of China's local police and prosecutors is very concerning. We're only able to identify 2 cases that's being recorded by official documents in China. Only 2 cases. One is in Spain, the one I mentioned, another one in Serbia. Well, we also discovered several different police stations all over the world. There are 50 something stations all over the world. And after trying to reach out to them, asking what kind of services they actually have, usually they don't answer. And then this is a new development we have found. The last one is the direct kidnapping, and I think you might have heard of the case of Gui Minghai, who is a Swedish national but of Chinese origins, and he was staying in Thailand at that time when Chinese agents actually came to his residence in Thailand and basically took him away. And he was then imprisoned until now. And also his daughter was reached out by Chinese agents saying that, well, she should not continue her advocacy for her father. And so this kind of method has been recorded, and we have seen even during COVID, those numbers have not been dropped. And there's a final case that is in Cyprus. Basically, it combined all this methods. So the target was basically requested under China's extradition treaty with Cyprus, but then it was not successful. And then so Chinese agents started to contact this person's wife, saying that, well, you are now targeted also by Interpol, and you might face extradition, or basically you can just convince your husband not to try to fight the extradition in court, and then so it will be fine. But then this also has to do with other family members, for example, also their kids in Cyprus was able to renew his passport, and then so his kid basically with nothing to do with his parents' activities, but still targeted. So this is kind of like a combined way. And also this person in Cyprus, his family members, 3 of them have been detained. All these ways by Chinese authorities to bring this person back. There are still more cases I would like to present, especially on the operations and the impact. And perhaps I'll also talk a bit on the asylum cases abroad, but I think I will leave it to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for sharing this kind of like state mechanisms used as a kind of instrument to reach out, like the dissident voices out of the countries. And so I'm gonna happy to open Q&A session. So we have multiple questions. So I pretty much try to bundle these questions around the topics. And one of the major questions that I get multiple times is, you know, as a democracy is in declining trend and authoritarianism is on the rise, and you actually reported many disturbing cases, you know, from Canada, from Eurasia, and Chinese activities. So, so how could democratic countries, states, can actually help us to mitigate this issue? So this is a general question, and it's a kind of policy-oriented question. I'll be happy to have all of your comments on that. Please jump in. Feel free to jump in if you want to respond to this question.
I'm happy to start us off. I think developing awareness is probably the first and most important thing. Making sure that democratic countries are aware that this is happening, making sure that this is something that law enforcement as well as the national security apparatus is situationally aware of, but also aware of specific incidences that are taking place in local communities. I think that's probably the most important first step. After that, there are a number of things that steps that can be taken. I think my colleagues and I have advised the FBI, for example, to set up a Uyghur language tip line, basically, that can be used specifically for Uyghurs to interface directly with the government and talk to the government and say, like, this is happening to us. So I think helping, for governments in particular, helping these communities, giving them the tools to advocate for themselves is helpful. That being said, there are a lot of conditions that we've all discussed here today that make advocating for oneself incredibly difficult, make that something that many of these members of communities do not necessarily want to do. And so I think making this a priority, making this a national security and law enforcement priority, and making sure that these communities are aware that they can speak out and that there won't necessarily be repercussions, and these governments are here to help protect them, I think is key. Particularly in cases of digital transnational repression, thinking primarily of the United States as I say this, and I am eager to hear what our Canadian and European colleagues have to say. But that is something that I think comes first and foremost to mind, is awareness on both parts, on the part of the government, but also helping Uyghur communities in the United States feel safe.
Thank you, Natalia.
I can just maybe supplement that a bit. I think those are excellent comments. I think in the Canadian context, it's interesting because we hear Canadian policymakers speak about, for example, foreign interference, but it's mostly, so it's a threat from abroad, but mostly framed as a threat against, for example, Canadian institutions versus direct attacks on the human rights of, for example, dissidents and activists who are Canadian or living in Canada. So I think having some kind of common language across different democratic states would really help sort of track this behavior and sort of form the basis for developing a unified policy response. Because I think the transnational and international nature of it means that I think it's inevitable that if this issue is going to be tackled more directly, it will require coordination across different jurisdictions. And then to Natalie's excellent point about helping people advocate for themselves, I think there's been some interesting ideas that Freedom House has also raised, but that we also sort of saw in our research that, for example, there's an opportunity to really sort of integrate an understanding of transnational oppression when someone, for example, first arrives in Canada through, for example, the refugee application system, or when they're interfacing, for example, with community organizations that work on helping someone get through the refugee system or the asylum system, refugee system in Canada. So that's one. So I think there's an opportunity really for sort of government community collaborations, and that sort of collaboration will be necessary, especially where there might be a lack of trust. And then another issue we saw in our research was this just lack of understanding and training among law enforcement regarding like what is transnational oppression, what are its digital dimensions. I think there's a ton of work that can be there. I mean, law enforcement, their reactions were often just quite dismissive, or they proposed solutions that were very expensive, like hire a private investigator, which I thought was a creative one, depending on the context. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there in terms of sensitizing law enforcement to be able to sort of understand what the concern is that's being brought to them. When it comes to digital repression, this is work that we are sort of actively thinking about more now, but there's definitely a role for social media companies in particular, because that's often where we see disinformation campaigns, smear campaigns, harassment happening, to step up and play better roles. So that forms part of a larger discussion about content moderation that I would probably is not worth getting into right now. But I think just to flag that there's definitely a role for private actors to help address this type of activity. And maybe Noura has some comments to add to this.
Thank you so much. You already, like both you and Natalie have raised, Natalia, sorry, have raised very important points. But I think one of the recommendations in mind, and we discussed this in many occasions, that usually people or dissidents in exile, especially in democracy, because we can talk about this later, but in democratic countries, they feel like somehow they don't know who's exactly in charge to receive these reports. This is one of the barriers, because it's a kind of mess. And whether if they report it to the intelligence forces, for instance, they would say okay, they might give them any kind of answers, for instance, hire your own bodyguard or stop posting your photos on social media. This is, by the way, it was one of the answers that one of the participants in our research received from the law enforcement when she reported online harassment targeting her. Anyways, this is one of the barriers that people usually don't know to which government agency they need to report. The other one, which is and somehow also the trust. The immigrant communities have long history of mistrust with many of the law enforcement agencies, and this issue should be addressed. Besides the other concern that the status of these people regarding, it could be one of the concerns, and their concerns about any information they might share with the law enforcement could be used against them. It might prevent them from sharing the information or reporting any kind of, whether digital or physical incidents targeting them. So all of these things together, we thought it could be solved through establishing a new agency, which is a combination between to play a coordination role between the government agencies. Civilians collaborate with the civil society from these communities, refugees and immigrant communities, support them, guide them to the proper agencies and institutions where they can seek help and can work on behalf of them with the law enforcement. This could be one of the ideas. Absolutely, there are a lot of things to think about and to propose, but we're thinking about the doable things. And definitely, justice and accountability is one of the most effective tools, because without justice, without accountability, there is nothing that would prevent the authoritarian regimes from keep and continue targeting dissidents, whether digitally or physically.
Thank you, Noura. Jing, would you like to tell something about it?
Yeah, and maybe just one kind of case that I found that is perhaps also the understanding of asylum, understanding of previous activities back home. So while for people coming out of authoritarian governments, here about China, especially the activity may not be as easy to be found, to prove that they have previously participating in human rights campaign and all this right defense. We have seen also a case where immigration, when reviewing the application, saying that, well, you can't really prove that you have been actively throughout the years being a human rights activist, and your role in this human rights movement aren't substantial. And this is also kind of an issue because, you know, sometimes in especially crackdown, we're saying after Xi Jinping took power, it's a bit hard for every single activist to be as present as before. And this also posed an issue for people who had this opportunity to go abroad and then to continue the advocacy, but then are being denied to stay. And then again, you know, it comes back to this issue. Well, if they are not able to like prove they have been actively, also very vocally advocating for human rights, then they might also face deportation. And then again, that's why we has been campaigning this non-refoulement principle that, you know, they should not be deported. And this is just one case that I think a lot of time immigration or those sort of knowledge are not being built in either law enforcement and also the immigration to be able to understand their situations.
Okay, thank you so much for your answers. And you pretty much highlighted the law enforcement and its role, you know, increase the awareness. And I just want to learn, you know, if you have further ideas about how to make law enforcement ready and prepare for this kind of transnational repression activities and also victimization, especially with Noura, you know, you provided pretty much specific and disturbing examples in Canada. Do you have any kind of further ideas about how to make law enforcement and security forces ready, especially in these countries like Canada?
I think, as Natalie mentioned, like knowledge is the first base. Most of the times we can't accuse the law enforcement that they are not willing to help, but maybe they don't have the proper understanding of of transnational repression and digital transnational repression. This is, I believe, like this is where the change should start. Besides the training on what are the best way to respond to these concerns and reports of dissidents and refugees in this country, addressing the other like when we speak about immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers, for sure we are speaking about one of the most vulnerable communities in any country around the world. So, and there are a lot of other dimensions to be addressed. For instance, the gender dimension, which is like very important. And most of the times it's like it's absent and it's not addressed, and whether in the governmental or in the law enforcement response on our speeches, along with others dimensions, as also Natalie mentioned, like the how to respond to the barriers of language. Many of these people don't speak the language of the formal language of the country, how to make things easy for them and easier for them to report and to communicate easily and directly with the law enforcement and the governmental agencies. And yeah, definitely the other kind of supports, for instance, the legal support, also the mental health support, which is like in many countries, it's not affordable and it's highly needed. Because as we presented, there's a lot of very serious and chilling effects on the dissidents' mental health and well-being in general. So I believe these are the issues or the practical recommendations in my mind. I don't know if the other folks have more to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Noura.
I just want to kind of give everything, or just said.
Natalie, you are mute. Sorry.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Wonderful. I just want to give a strong +1 to everything that Noura just said. Like, absolutely. And I think the United States government has done a decent job of, I think, taking the matter seriously. The FBI has written a number of bulletins specifically speaking to the digital transnational repression threat that Uyghurs face in the United States. And there are specific designations in various legislation that has passed through Congress that the intelligence community has to report back to Congress about specific matters involving the Uyghur community, some of which involves the Uyghur community here in the United States, most of which is particularly pertaining to what's going on in Xinjiang proper. So we're seeing this developing awareness. And I think, the Biden administration has spoken out about transnational oppression and explicitly started calling it that. It started using that term to address this array of problems. And so I think that we're starting to see in the United States a sea change. We are starting to see that happening. But I think what we're looking for more now is for that to become, obviously the wheels of bureaucracy turn slowly. We would like to see things move a little bit faster. And I think the universal use of this term, as Siena mentioned and Noura mentioned, across jurisdictions, across, within government, and then also across governments internationally, I think is something that I really want to double down on and emphasize is really important into how we talk about this. Because it's very hard to build awareness if we're not all on the same page about what it is that we're talking about. And so I think while the Biden administration is doing a really great job, I think there's more to be done. And I think we want to see that. And to Jing's point during the last segment, I think one of the other things that greatly concerns human rights organizations, particularly pertaining to Uyghurs, is refugee status in the United States. That's something that we see a lot. There's a lot of Uyghurs stuck in the pipeline at the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service. And so I think getting clarity about the status of their applications, being able to accelerate that process, give them a special designated status, is something that we also are really advocating for on a regular basis, and is something that's really important to giving these Uyghurs a place to go when places like Turkey and Tajikistan and Ukraine are not safe. So that's something I also just wanted to add.
Thank you, Natalia.
I would like to add also the issue of deportation, as Natalie just mentioned that, sometimes, well, in terms of deportation, they would send them to, say, countries where they have on the flight, but then also it might be dangerous also for them, because they might be countries where there are certain judicial cooperation or deportation agreements where they can also be sent to China. And we have seen also cases like that. We also call it a kind of a different way of indirect activities they do in order to bring the targets back to China. Another thing that we have also observed is this China's diplomatic promises to different governments or the law enforcement, especially when law enforcement are about to send those victims to China. China usually kind of say that, well, we're going to ensure this person won't be persecuted, or at least to follow our law. But then there's no always, well, it's not always that like the law enforcement know about China's rule of law issues, issues of sex lawyer, issues in terms of torture in detention. So then this kind of diplomatic promises are not supposed to be considered and supposed to be invalid. And then we also know that by international law, diplomatic promises cannot be a way for government to be like, then we're okay to deport this person or extradite this person to another country. So that is just another issue I would like to highlight. Maybe coming back to that law enforcement, well, in general, as I mentioned, that we have found certain let's say extraterritorial activities of China's police in different parts of the world. We have found many in Europe, especially big cities where Chinese nationals tend to live. We are very sad that, well, so far we have only seen Canada, the US, Portugal, and Spain start to have investigation, but they're not other countries, for example, Germany, Netherlands, or other countries that start to take this seriously. As we know about, dissidents abroad, either they have the status of refugees or they have the status of professionals, students abroad. They might still be targeted by this overseas policing measures by the Chinese authorities, and this could be also not just by Chinese governments, but also other countries' authorities operating abroad. And I think this kind of sense of understanding and this this urgency for those governments or city municipal governments to act is very important. But sadly, we haven't seen really much done by all these governments.
Siena, you're a lawyer, and especially for law enforcement to be effective, there should be a legal framework, right, to enforce the law. and you talk about the challenges. Do you see any kind of improvements in the legal framework?
Yeah, I think one of our recommendations we made is that there needs to be a serious examination in Canada and elsewhere regarding how prosecutions of these types of cases would work because of the extraterritorial dimension. So that's one complication. And I guess another one is for victims or targets seeking a remedy. There's also this issue of the complications ensuing a foreign state in particular that, potentially could be resolved by some particular legislative amendments or particular legislation that would at least facilitate this type of litigation. So I think I don't have any great answers right now, but I think it's definitely an area that needs to be explored further to both facilitate criminal prosecutions, but also civil prosecutions brought by targets.
Okay, another question is, especially to Natalia, you talk about disturbing cases in Turkey and in the region. So do you see a kind of a specific role for the United Nations and other international organizations to deal with this issue?
That's a very good question. And
you are mute, Natalia. Sorry.
Sorry, is this better?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Mute bingo. I think particularly with the Uyghur ongoing humanitarian crisis that we see both abroad and within Xinjiang and the human rights violations and the genocide. After what we've seen recently from the UN, I think it is very difficult to have a lot of hope in international organizations helping out. If a vote can't even get outside the specific human rights body of the UN to have a discussion on what is happening in China, I think it is very difficult to hold out hope that the UN is going to step up and play a significant role in any way, shape, or form regarding this crisis. And I think one of the other things that we often see is that Uyghurs claiming refugee status through the UN are not necessarily safe from refoulement or detention. And so I think recognizing that the UN has a purpose and does good in the world, I think, yes, it does. And I don't think we should abolish the UN for any reason. I think that it has a purpose and has a role and does good work. But I think that there are also serious limitations to that work that need to be considered and discussed and addressed in a thoughtful and I think comprehensive way, because there are things happening outside the UN framework that the UN hasn't been able to help with. And I think evaluating that and discussing that is important and something that is above the calling of this panel perhaps, but something to be discussed on a broader scale at a later date.
Anybody wants to add on? Okay, so another question from one of our senior fellows, Davut Akçay. He actually, wants to be specific about your research, and then especially Noura and Siena, your research. How do you actually recruit these victims, and especially in a kind of scary environment, and how you can make sure that they are going to be safe by sharing their experiences?
I can go. So yeah, to be honest, in the beginning, it was a bit challenging because although some cases were reported publicly through the media, but we know for sure that more cases were not reported, and the victims didn't feel safe to speak. Or to share the targeting they've experienced publicly. So we started actually by speaking to the activists from the communities, and it took us a while to recruit the final number of participants in our study. Basically, we managed to recruit 19 participants from I believe a good diverse demographies, for instance, from Rwanda, Saudi Arabia, China, Yemen, Syria, Hong Kong, Tibet, Afghanistan, Baluchistan, Iran, and East Turkestan. So it was tough, but we managed to do it. The other thing, I believe, like this kind of research, besides like the ethical protocol we had, building trust with the participants, we responded. We have like open and honest discussion with them about the data, about how we're gonna save and protect their data, the information they're sharing with us, and what are the outcomes are gonna be. I believe one of the issues that assured them on top of everything is how they can share their stories, and the anonymity like give them some kind of assurance that they're at least they're mitigating the risk, and they're not expecting themselves to face any consequences, because many of them were like saying, we still have family and relatives back home. We don't want them to face any kind of consequences. This is why we don't want any identifying information to be shared. And this is what we did exactly while drafting the report. And afterwards, we check with them on the first draft and the second draft, if they are satisfied with the information, if they feel comfortable with the like amount of information we are sharing and how we are writing their stories. So making the balance was a bit hard, but I think like also building the trust is very important. And here's, by the way, what was missing in the media, if I want to just give a hint about the area to improve, is like the vast majority of technical reports about the spyware exploit and digital threats, for instance, targeting dissidents, were only focusing on the technical aspect without addressing the voices of the victims. And what we've been seeing like over the last 2 or 3 years was like good steps moving forward in addressing the voices of these people. But I believe like more work should be done, because we need more stories and centering their voices instead of just speaking to the experts and to people who can give us like the proper and broader view of the information. Siena, if you please jump in.
No, I think that's great. The only thing I would add is that we're actually now sort of we're continuing this research by investigating in more depth what we call the gender dimensions of digital transnational repression. So really understanding how women in particular are impacted by this type of behavior, and sort of what techniques states are using when they undertake, in particular, digital transnational repression, but it also obviously brings in other forms of transnational repression. So I think there's definitely, so it's going a little bit to the left of the question, but there's an opportunity, I think, to really develop sort of research into particular aspects of digital transnational repression, such as gender, or the with continuation on the psychological and social impacts. That will be interesting in understanding really what the impact is of this type of transnational activity, which will hopefully contribute to advocacy efforts to counter it.
Yeah, thanks so much for your insights. Actually, if you look at the Q&A, there are like many questions. There are some specific questions. If you want to go over and answer one of these, please feel free to do so. As you know, we discussed about the law enforcement and their resources and the legal framework. Natalia, you talk about a tip line for FBI. It's very interesting to hear about it. So would you please let us know more about how it works and how you reach to the people, the vulnerable groups and the communities, and whether it's functional right now?
To be clear, that was a
Natalia. So cannot hear again. Sorry. Yeah.
How's this?
This is working now.
Okay. I keep clicking the off mute button, and it seems to be clear, that was a recommendation. That has not been implemented yet. That is something that we would really like to see. And I think, obviously this requires hiring someone who's Uyghur, someone who speaks Uyghur, to be on staff, to be on the other end of the phone, when the tip line is called or when the email is sent about, hey, I'm experiencing digital transnational repression in the United States, whatever form that might take, there needs to be someone on the other end who understands not only the language, but the transnational repression aspect of it, why individuals are experiencing this transnational repression, who really gets it in that deep and profound and really meaningful way. So I think that's probably the first thing. I think also then after that, advertising, that PR messaging out there in the world into these communities that says, like, this is a resource. We are specifically, coming to you with this resource. And so I think, as Siena and Noura have really outlined, I think there's a really ample room there for civil society and government to partner to help get that message out there if such a thing were to be implemented, which, it would be really great if it was. There's a lot of room for partnership there. There's a lot of room that, civil society organizations can really carry that message to individual people. And I think communicating, broadly speaking, that no one of these individuals who is facing this is facing it alone is really key. And I think the civil society organizations are starting to really lean into that messaging. And I think there's a role for government to play in that as well. And so I think having government step up and engage and be involved at that level would be great. I would love to see it. It would be really phenomenal.
Is anybody else wants to join in?
Just probably want to add, well, at least like the form of transnational repression we found are usually without any evidence left or any, notice, official email stuff that we can actually trace back and to be able to identify. So that is also a bit difficult for victims to come to us, and then, well, not just us, but any other human rights organizations working on this issue. And I think in this case, it must be also, be on the agenda for law enforcement or governments in general to know that there are this form of illegal ways to reach out to people, and it's hard to identify where those threats are. But then we're still in the process of figuring it out. But kind of having a platform for people to report those cases and to be kind of able to gather all this data and then to see the patterns would be also important. We're still looking for ways to have a proper system to record this weight of reprisal, transnational repression abroad. And yeah, I think that would be also very useful for, say, in the future, different governments want to find out all these activities.
Okay, so we are almost on time, like completing the session. I really thank you so much for your great comments and your insights and your great works and the great conversation today on transnational repression. And thank you for joining us. I hope to see you all at our future events. Thank you so much and have a great day.